and the Lady Dean of the Law Faculty, who, if I can hand over to Lady Dean. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judge. Greetings, everybody. I hope I can be heard. Allow me, first of all, to bring greetings and apologies from our Rector and Vice Chancellor, the very Reverend Stephen Bogwa, who would have loved to be here, but because of exigencies of work, he couldn't. And on their behalf and on behalf of the entire Quair family, we welcome you here. I cannot tell you how happy we are that you've made Quair the venue of choice. As we thank the organizers for this, we do hope that the reasoning behind making Quair an avenue of choice is not informed only by a geographical positioning and close proximity to the epicenter of the Mau Mau uprising. We hope that this choice is symbolic in the sense that we at Quair stand for what we stand for and the role we play in recognition of matters justice. We are an institution of higher learning that breaks new frontiers in order to deliver value-based, value-adding higher education. In line with the aspirations of our mother institution, Quair, our law school, whose patron saint, incidentally, is a celebrated 16th century English jurist, Sir Thomas More, aspires to train, form, and role model transformative, God-fearing leaders for church and society in the region. I think that we benchmark against the person of Jesus Christ, the compassionate advocate, judge, and author of all justice. We are able to do this effectively because we have other schools that work with us and other collaborations. And the fact that our students are in the majority here does speak for us. And therefore, the Mau Mau legacy could not find a better home and platform from which to amplify the voices as they begin important discourse and conversations on the soil and continent of Africa. On behalf of our Vice Chancellor, again, I want to welcome you here and wish you an engaging and rewarding conference. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the words of the Vice Chancellor and the welcome by Lady Dean of the Law Faculty. And can I just say thank you to all those in Quair for hosting us, and the very excellent welcome I got personally when I first came some months ago to Quair and saw a marvelous seminar for law students getting into the profession. What I want to do is we have an eclectic lineup of panelists and speakers. So what I'd like to do without further ado is introduce our speakers who will talk on this part one session about the Mau Mau legacy for Africa. So the first panelist that is due to speak is Professor Nicholas Githuku. He's a Kenyan by birth and is currently teaching in the CUNY University in New York. And he has written and spoken at length on Mau Mau, but he's one of the noted academics on the subject. So I would call upon Professor, if he's in the room, to start with his presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Those of you who are joining from Quair and elsewhere in the UK, and greetings to everyone wherever you may be. And thanks, Judge Peter Herbert, for inviting me to this auspicious occasion. I've added today's topic of discussion, conceptualizing Mau Mau, the subtitle of my brief remarks, which is Post-Colonial Legacy and Lineage of Colonial Era Genealogy of Grievance. It's 1962, and MC Manbi, the director of intelligence in colonial Kenya, is persuaded that the Land and Freedom Army, the KLFA, which appeared as soon as the original Mau Mau movement was effectively put down, was founded on its ashes. In this conviction, the director of intelligence was not alone in making this security assessment. When one reads the official correspondence that is passing between authorities in London and Nairobi, one is sure to find that there was a clear and unflattering understanding that Mau Mau of the early 1950s was the very same phenomenon as the KLFA, which emerges at the end of the 1950s and the early 1960s. The KLFA, which was gaining strength and momentum in the 1960s, traced its genealogy of grievance to nascent Kikuyu political agitation of the 1920s and even earlier. An anonymous letter written by a KLFA member indicates no distinction whatsoever between them and the Mau Mau, stating that members of the movement were unhappy with the colonial order since 1920 at the time of Harry Thuku. The letter also referred to similar sacrifices made at the time of Chege Kibashia during the labor crisis of Uplands, probably in the 1940s. But the worst experience, the author wrote, was between 1952 and 1959. So at a time when it seemed like the back of African descent had been broken, the spirit of anti-colonialism and dissent continued to simmer unabated well into the 1960s, the 1970s, and beyond in Kenya, even after independence. And indeed, post-colonial dissent is often not couched in the same language, strength of sentiment, and sometimes the same terms. In fact, the 1982 Kenya Air Force coup attempt was in many ways a microcosm of the 1950s colonial struggle, although played out within a much smaller, shorter time. When the airmen stormed and temporarily took over the Voice of Kenya broadcasting station, they issued a political statement that echoed the call for social justice and framed and explained their actions in the language of grievance that harked back to British colonial days. It is quite evident, therefore, that the stubborn spirit of Mau Mau, the mentality of struggle, has endured in Kenya's collective memory and psyche and has continued to be a touchstone, not only of the nation's political history, but also a focal point in the production of popular culture while informing and influencing contemporary political movements such as the feared Mungiki, the Sabaot Land Defense Force, the Mombasa Republican Council, which together represent prime examples of such far-reaching genealogy of grievance and social protest. Reference to the Mau Mau movement and its unquenched quest is constantly being made in the socially conscious music of artists and bands such as Kala Mashaka, Uko Fulani Mau Mau, Dan Chizia Seda, Eric Wainaina, among others. Moreover, a few of Kenyan intellectuals such as S. Atieno Waziyambo, my friend Goyo Waziongo, Mesere Mogo, and Maina Wakenyati, to mention but a few, have ever so consciously continued the struggle for total liberation, and not just in the East African nation, but also beyond in the continent. To conclude my brief remarks, I must say that it was quite clear to me when I first started research on this colonial phenomenon back in 2010 and 2015, when my PhD dissertation was published as a monograph, that the existential struggle that produced the Mau Mau psychology or mentality resulting to violence and bloodshed in the tumultuous 1950s still lacked in the post-colony and on the continent, and it still does today. It's therefore my very deep-seated belief, after doing this work for so many years, that a close analysis of numerous locales of simmering and sometimes unspoken discontent that may have existed or that still exist among Kenyans or Africans by large, but especially the kind that has been captured and recorded and archived and therefore by extension been immortalized through the creative work of fiction and music, will show an unbroken lineage of or genealogy of grievance that harks back to the colonial times and even much earlier into the present. These then called for close attention and response by government through policies that address critical issues of historical social justice, especially land scarcity and addressing pressing issues of social well-being. But alas, and I'll talk about Kenya here, a cursory glance at what has been happening on the political front in Kenya is worrying and concerning, especially in this period of the corona pandemic. That is, we see glaring socio-economic inadequacies and blatant inequality, facing scarcity that coexists alongside shameless surfeit. This therefore ensures the continuation of the same circumstances that produced the Mau Mau violence of the 1950s, sporadic conflict in the Mount Elgon region, where the Sabaot Land Defense Force reared its head, and the Mombasa Republican Council, whose call for secession led to a bitter clash between them and the government. And it must be noted here that the MRC in the coast was not quite snuffed out, but rather forced to go underground. And these are all issues and hotspots that call for a much more sober and urgent handling of the respective long-standing historical injustices, as well as ending once and for all runaway corruption and channeling resources to where they're most needed within society, that is healthcare, education, the widening of the network of roads and railways, adequate agricultural production, housing, and rural electrification. Mucho gracias, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Githuku, for that marvelous presentation. What we'd like to do and pick up later in the discussion is the way in which the diaspora can help the struggle here in Kenya. And so one of the things the speakers will be doing when we go to the panel discussion is look at the political strategy that might work to make a difference for the Mau Mau legacy in all its various forms. Can I now turn to somebody I met very early on in the land rights issue, and she is the CEO of Kenya Land Alliance, a marvelous human rights activist and lawyer who worked on Mau Mau 1 and has extensive experience in terms of the history and the struggle to achieve justice for the survivors and their descendants. So can I ask, without any further ado, if Faith Alube can give her presentation and join us on the debate. Thank you. I think, Faith, if you can hear me, you need to unmute your microphone and put your video on. Just give it a couple of minutes and see if she can link on. I've just sent her a text on WhatsApp, so I think she knows. If not, what I would do is maybe ask Mrs. Kamathi. Oh, she said she can hear and see us, but that's all. So I think there's a technical issue maybe. All right, well, she said that she's unmuted, so I don't know if the technical manager in the back end can work that. All right, well, let me pass that for a moment. And can I turn, if I can, to somebody that Faith Alube introduced me to, which is a person that almost needs no introduction whatsoever, is Mrs. Kimathi, Evelyn Kimathi, who is the CEO of the Dedan Kimathi Foundation. And I would ask her to, you can present with me here if you wish. Yeah. Ah, there's Faith. Sorry. Should I?
It's okay. She can.
Is it? Okay. All right. So I understand Faith has joined us. Apologies. Faith, I've done your introduction. I hope it was sufficiently expansive, but can I hand over the floor to you? Thank you very much indeed. Faith Alube of the Kenya Land Alliance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you to the organizers of this forum. It's always a pleasure to be able to share my experiences, especially in regards to my work with the Mau Mau project for the last almost 10 years. I worked for the Kenya Human Rights Commission before working at the Kenya Land Alliance. And at the Kenya Human Rights Commission, I was the officer that was in charge of executing the out-of-court settlement from the Royal Court of Justice in the UK. But even before then, I was also part of the team that worked with the veterans to come up with the claimants. The 5,228 were as a process of screening, and we started out with 50,000 veterans. I'd just like to clarify that the Kenya Land and Freedom Army was not mainly participants from the central Kenya. If you look at the list of the beneficiaries, we had veterans from the coastal region, from the Mekatilili Womenza movement. We had participants from Nandi, from the Koitalera Samoi movement. We had participants from Turkana. We had veterans from Dinia Musambwa from Western. We had veterans from Magenta Highland, those are Luos. And we also had veterans from Narok, and we had veterans from the Oloibon homestead in Masai. So I'd just like to correct that the liberation movements were diverse and across, and were derived from across the country. We started out with 50,000 veterans before we filed the test suits in 2009. And then initially we had 6 veterans that were the face of the test suits, but we ended up having only 4 due to some reason or another. And out of the 4, 2 are deceased right now. We only have Paul Ndiku. Jane passed on last year. She was the only lady, and the other gentleman. And I'd just like to say that as a person who worked with liberation movements for a while now, I'd say that the more things change, the more they remain the same. Because the veterans, the Kenya Land and Freedom Army went to the bush to fight for land and freedom. From where I sit, even after disbursing the tokens, because that cannot be a recompense, each veteran was getting 340,000 Kenyan shillings, that is around 340 pounds. Each veteran was appreciated in the out-of-court settlements, because the out-of-court settlement had 3 parts. The first part was the statement of regret from the then Prime Minister, William Hague. The second part consisted of the tokens to 5,228 veterans. And the third part was the construction of a memorial at the Freedom Corner, or the Wangari Maathai Corner at Uhuru Park. And we are forever grateful to the governor of Nairobi, Governor Evans Kidero, who gave us land, or who allowed us to be able to construct that monument at Uhuru Park. So I'd say the first part was a little bit straightforward because it was a statement of regret. The veterans acknowledged at least the UK government or former colonial administrators had admitted a form of responsibility towards the torture, cruelty, and ill treatment that was meted out on them during the colonial era. The second part of some form of compensation, that's too small to be called compensation, we're calling them tokens. By the time I was leaving the Kenya Human Rights Commission, we had been able to disburse at least 5,200 to the veterans. The remaining 28 were undergoing some form of succession because some of the veterans died before the process could be completed. And the third part, I normally tell people we really dragged constructing, we really delayed, we tarried constructing that memorial because of, I'd say, politics. It took us 2 years to draft 400 words, and it took us so long because there are some words that we could not agree to use, or the FCO, the Foreign Commonwealth Office, did not want to see some words initially. Words like Mau Mau, words like freedom, words like the Kenya Land and Defense Army, words like Ukombozi, words, they were saying that by the time we were constructing the memorial, the second case, which was being handled by the Tandem Law and Cecil Miller on the Kenyan side, was already filed. So they were like, we should not mention some words because there's still an ongoing suit. Unfortunately, the second suit could not go through, it collapsed. But by the time we were constructing the memorial, it took us 2 years to draft 400 words into 4 plaques and translate the English version into the Swahili version. So as I conclude, I'd like to say that from the experience I've gained, or from my insights from working with them, we faced a lot of challenges then. I'd say the first one is the exclusion of recognition, or the lack of recognition of the role of women in the liberation movement or in the liberation struggle. The women themselves, when you spoke to them, they portrayed a very strong allegiance to the cause that they were fighting for, but they suffered. And one of the things that we used to be curious about is if the women also suffered, if the women also suffered violence or from their male colleagues while out in the bush, because there was some pain there. The women also suffered a lot from the pain that was meted out on them by colonial administrators that managed detention centers. I'd say the second challenge was the factionalism within the veteran ranks. Everybody believed that where they were fighting from, if you're fighting from Mount Kenya, that was more authentic. If you're fighting from Meru, if you're fighting from Machakos, that was more authentic. So factionalism was also a challenge. Resourcing the action of seeking a remedy was also very expensive. And at some point we did crowdfunding, and the veterans themselves also really chipped in. Movements, because most of them had been incapacitated by either historical marginalization, just outright poverty, or even just a lack of, I can say, they don't feel like it was worth it because they never got what they were fighting for. As I conclude, if I just compare the circumstances that the veterans went to the bush for and what we work for right now, as I'd say, the veterans went to the bush to fight for land and freedom. As the director of Kenya Land Alliance, I'd tell you that policies are still being created to favor the elite, just like they were being developed that are during colonial period to favor the elite. Policies that are being developed right now. Some of us do not even understand. We do not understand those policies because you get that they favor the 30% landowners, because 70% of our country is unregistered. The lay people, and I'd say the relatively poor people, live on community lands, which are 70% of our lands and are largely unregistered. A law was passed in 2016, and I'll still tell you that the process favors the elites within these community lands. Private lands, the laws are very clear, just like it was back then. So our land laws are still informed by colonial legacies. When you talk about freedom that the veterans fought for, right now in Kenya, with every other mega project, the contracts, we do not even know where they are. It's not public. It's not public. The documents are not public. The concessions are not public. There's a thin line between disclosure and rights to information in my country. So what freedom are we talking about if I cannot access a concession that my government entered into and which is affecting a large number of people? That is also a colonial policy. And I'd give an example. Tullow Oil, which is, by the way, a UK-based company, is claiming 340 billion from the Kenyan government. We do not know if the 340 billion is for the production of oil and which oil. That is the same thing, the same incentive that they used to be given during the colonial era in order to operate in my country, Kenya. So I'd say as things change, the more they remain the same. So as we talk about the Mau Mau legacy, I think I'm alive to the fact that the land and freedom that they went to fight for in the bush is still an issue now. It's changed its dynamics, and there are so many dimensions, but we are still fighting for land and some form of freedom. We are always under a form of bondage, even as we continue to fight for the land and freedom that they fought for in the 50s. Thank you very much, Peter.
I realized very, very quickly what an enormous amount of work had been done by Faith and others, and to make a huge difference. So I was a barrister, a part-time judge in London. I heard and saw the Mau Mau cases. What I didn't realize, but I imagined, the huge amount of effort that had gone into even getting those cases to court. And as I know as a lawyer and a recently retired judge, that generally speaking, going to white people for justice is always hard work, particularly if you're talking about a struggle in anywhere on the continent. They are, in a sense, as Steve Biko had said many years ago, they are the people who kick you, and then later on they tell you how to respond to those kicks. And so in a sense, the mere fact of Mau Mau veterans going to court in London and asking 3 elderly white men for justice of itself is an interesting spectacle. Really, those answers should be on the continent. They should be in the African Court of People and Human Rights down the road in Arusha in Tanzania. They should be within the African Union, and they should be within ourselves. It shouldn't necessarily be the fact that you have to go to London or Paris or Berlin or anywhere else to ask for colonial injustices to be righted. But in actual fact, you do, because they refuse to make those concessions until you go to their backyard. And so without further ado, can I ask Mrs. Kimathi to join me on the podium, please? She is the CEO of the Dedan Kimathi Foundation. As you will know, and she will say, again, that is the person who carried the torch for the Mau Mau struggle and paid the ultimate price as well for that. Can I hand over to you?
Yes,
in all humility? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judge Herbert. My name is Evelyn Wanjiku Kimathi, the last born of Dedan Kimathi and Mokami Kimathi. I'm the CEO of Dedan Kimathi Foundation. And this evening, I'm very much so much humbled to see the world, Kenyans and Africans, all coming together to support what Mau Mau stood for. I'm happy that I'm not a stranger to Judge Herbert. I'm not a stranger to Dr. Kelsey. I'm not a stranger to Lady, the one who presented the first Mau Mau case. I'm not a stranger to Faith Arube. These people, we have been working for all this time because they feel that nothing has been done. Mau Mau legacy stood where they were told by the government to surrender their weapons at Rainbow Stadium in 1963. Mau Mau from Embu, from Meru, Mount Kenya region, from Abadia regions, thousands and thousands of fighters. They surrendered their weapons in Rainbow Stadium, and they were applauded. They were relations, but unfortunately, immediately after that, our freedom fighters were just left there in the tents. The government officials who had come from Nairobi, they just went back to Nairobi, never to turn back. And our fighters were left there for 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And what they got after that is to come to be told, you must get out of Gabon. Their lands and have been, if you had Mau Mau, your land was confiscated. Then Kimathi, my father's land, was confiscated because he was a hardcore Mau Mau. Other freedom fighters, their land was confiscated. Where could all these people go? Some of them, like General Baimoige from Meru, decided to go back to the forest. And they were inherited people. We don't know who could.
Just doing a Zoom pack.
Oh.
Hey, how are you doing? My name's Lee Jasper. I'm former Deputy Mayor of London and delighted to welcome everybody across the world who's watching and connecting with this important discussion about the Mau Mau legacy for Africa and the wider connotations for the relationships between the previous colonial powers and how those injustices continue to play out today within Kenya and the African continent. I'm delighted to be amongst so many learned activists and guests, both in the political sphere, the Kenyan activist sphere, both in terms of environment and land rights, and many others, esteemed guests and colleagues from across the Kenyan diaspora. You know, here in the United Kingdom, when we think about Kenya, we tend to think about a independent African nation that we expect to be flourishing and thriving in the post-colonial context. But when we deep dive a little closer to that and we look at the colonial legacy of the issue of land rights in Kenya, then we see a totally different scenario where individual Kenyans are subjected to sort of plantation-like conditions on the global conglomerates, many of whom are based here in the United Kingdom, whether that's tea farms or pineapple plantations, or even the Talua oil company that I think one of our guests mentioned earlier that is based in the United Kingdom, and it's currently got a £140 billion contract from the Kenyan government for what we're not entirely sure, as nobody can know. But what we do see is the seeding of these legacies over time that have continued to perpetuate the consistent injustice that people within Kenya continue to face. And of course, Mau Mau is one of the most egregious examples of that. I think it was early on that Peter Herbert, my good friend and colleague, was saying how iniquitous it is that these elderly freedom fighters who fought for land and freedom had to find themselves, sitting in front of three old white judges here in the United Kingdom to seek justice for colonial injustice. There should have been a commission based in Kenya to solve these matters, and the access to justice should have been located on the African continent. To that extent, I agree with Peter. But notwithstanding all of the issues in relation to the Mau Mau settlement, and we've heard today that although some matters were resolved legally, there are still many outstanding issues that Britain has a historic responsibility for, and which we still have to continue the fight to press the British government to make good on the issue of neo-colonial justice for the legacies of colonialism here in Kenya. But Kenyan government itself has to play its role. And if Britain is now seeking trade agreements with Kenya in relation to it's now being a post-European nation, Brexit Britain as we call it over here, then surely the context of some of these issues need to be located within those trade agreements to say, yes, we're happy to have trade agreements with the UK, but we do want to ensure that some of the injustices that continue to scar the lives of Kenyans right up until the present day are resolved within that trade agreement context. It can't be a big rush just to, chop the business deals and leave all the other issues aside. I think Kenyan government, really must support the people by making sure environmental concerns, the legacy colonial concerns in terms of land and ownership within Kenya, and of course, the ethical conditionalities that are important for future Britain investment and trade with Kenya, all should be foremost in the negotiations for an independent trade agreement. And that that trade agreement is exemplified by some of the stories we've heard. When I visited Kenya, I was surprised and appalled to hear that people who had been convicted of stealing a single pineapple were in jail awaiting trial for 2, 3, 4 years. I mean, this kind of injustice is unthinkable, and part of the responsibility of the Kenyan government is to ensure not only justice on the international platform, but justice is dispensed much more keenly, much more effectively locally, particularly in relation to the issues that I've just mentioned. So it's important we value our relationship with our Kenyan colleagues. We want to ensure that here in London and the United Kingdom that we're alive to the Kenyan agenda for justice post these colonial times, and that we continue to discuss together in a formal pact, bringing together the African diaspora here in UK, in wider Europe. There's something like 50 million Africans throughout the whole of Europe. The African diaspora is huge in that regard. They're out there. They're people that we can bring into a global African justice competition.
Lee, thank you. Apologies for that technical hitch there, and thank you for Lee is actually in our part 2 panel, so thanks for stepping in because we lost the signal for some reason. So apologies for the interruption, but please continue.
Thank you. Thank you again. Let me go back to where I was. I was saying about the trauma, the scare that Mau have been living with, entering the forest, waging a guerrilla warfare to the colonialist, to the intruder who came here to take the best of their land. And they decided it's enough is enough. You're gonna go back to your country where you came from, leave our country, we live in peace. And then after that, they were treated as if they were savages, they were bandits who had run into the forest to do banditry. It's very traumatizing. But I thank God for the people who have continued to stand with the Mau Mau, the Kenyan human rights, the international community, the people who are sympathizers of Mau Mau. And I also thank you, Kenya government in some places where they said the Mau Mau was no longer a proscribed group. And also, I can also thank you, the current government, because we have tried to approach the current government, which is head by a son, who we believe that he's a son of Mau Mau, Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta. We believe he's a son of Mau Mau, and he's still to convince us that he's a son of Mau Mau by doing a gesture, not to only the Mau Mau freedom fighters, because Mau Mau was not only fought by Kikuyus or people from Mount Kenya. The freedom struggle started all the way in 1819 when during the time of Mekatilwa Menza, when he said, "You are not going to be intruders in our country." We have Muthoni Nyanjiro, we have Koitalel Arap Samoei, who started a liberation movement in the Nandi County. Until now, we have the Tarai clan who are still homeless. We are celebrating 100 years of Tarai clan. They were moved from where they lived to another place. I've gone there so many places. I've visited Mekatilwa family. So these things, the Waiyaki Wahinga, who was buried alive. We have Hari Thuku, who led who was the trade unionist. They led movements of saying that this is our land. We're gonna not come to our land, take the prime land, the most fertile land, and you leave the natives without anything. And that's why the Mau Mau, I was saying the struggle started way back. You have heard Faith saying there are ships that said that so it's not good for the colonialists to come to our country and take it as theirs. But we cannot give all the credit to Mau Mau. The only credit we can give to Mau Mau is the war. Yani, they took arms. It was the military wing of COW, and they decided to enter the forest, not because they like to enter the forest. Forest life was not the best, but they entered the forest after seeing people being charged 10 bob to take the cattle to the deep. And it's a day you are being paid 2 cents per day, and you are told to pay for 10 shillings for your cattle to go to the deep. Another thing, they were told to wear shorts. They were told to wear, they were called the something that was put around the knee, and they were not allowed to enter hotels like Norfolk. It was a no-go zone for for black people. I can give first-hand information from my mother, Mrs. Dead, the wife of the Field Marshal Dedan Kimathi. She was in class 3 and she had screams from Yoda or beyond on the other side of the valley. And when they went to check who was screaming, they saw a man, the neighbor, being beaten, and he was beaten to death. When they asked why he was beaten, they were told that he has refused to pay for the cattle dip, which was so much for him because he could not afford. And from that day, Mrs. Kimathi decided to join the movement. So people were not joining the movement because they wanted. It's pain. It was too much. And then people started to be killed by the colonialists who were starting to resist. It was something that it had reached the peak of agitating for the freedom and for their right. And that's why we have Dedan Kimathi Foundation, which is still agitating for Mau Mau veterans, other freedom families like the one I've seen, Mekatilwa Menza, Wayaki Wahinga, Dini Amsabwa of Eraija Masinde, Kotaleo Raf Samoei. We are agitating for their rights. Even if everyone would not fit to get a piece of land, at least they be given some appreciations, some tokens, some monuments. At least we show that this freedom, their initiative to gather all to unite all the children of the veterans we are calling Mau Mau descendants. We have
the remains identified there. Now, one of the most prolific cases of Mau struggle is the whereabouts of the human remains of Dedan Kimathi. And that is probably to the families that are affected. The resources we provided for the identification of those remains, psychological support we provided to the relatives. But when the governments made so, while we want justice, or we acknowledge or we want something memorial that is symbolic about the state, autopsy is something that we consider in that regard to identify those remains.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. Thank you.
The third thing is that families are very central to the process before, during, and after the actual forensic work. It's very important to also not create false expectations for families. So we have to be very honest with families what they will be expecting from a forensic intervention to identify, to exhume, identify, and the human remains that are to be returned to the communities. And then the legal context must be very clearly defined. So are we building a judicial case, or are we retrieving human remains for closure? So with those remarks, I think just in concluding, I'd like to say that it is very important to understand the governance of addressing human rights violations. And if we are to practically address them, then we need to discuss forensic interventions, the forensic ecosystems required to address those human rights violations, whether they be violations touching on crimes against humanity, or on war crimes, touching on crimes such as the atrocities that were committed by the British colonial rule in Kenya. So I think I'd like to end that there, and I can take any further questions after.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kelsey. Thank you. I had a text that Faith Alube would like to add some words, because she also worked on the issue of mass graves over the last few years. So I don't know if the studio could access Faith back in the room. Can that be done? Just see if.
Thank you very much.
Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I just like to what Dr. Kelsey had said. During the research, when we were working with the veterans.
We can't hear you here. I don't know if you're on mute.
Yeah, no, it's the studio. It's the studio. Can you hear me now?
Not really, no. No.
It's the studio.
I think it may be the studio. Let me just ask them what's happened. Apologies, everybody. Apparently, they can hear you on the live link. It's within this room. We can't hear you. Let me just ask the studio at the back. Can you hear me on the live link? Is it possible we can get the audience in the room to hear Faith? Because at the moment, they can just hear me. All right, Faith, what I'm going to do, is there a way we can get Faith so the sound comes through in the room, please? Yeah, we're not getting Faith. I can see her, and apparently she's on the live link, but we're not hearing her.
Also, we could not transfer the audio to the other computer and also the system.
I don't understand that.
No, we are using a sound from this laptop.
Right.
As maybe if you tell the technician here to add the technician in here.
Right. Okay. Sorry. What we think we'll try and do is to get the technician to add you to their system here. I'm not sure why. Paul, is it possible to get Faith sound, please? Faith, I think what we're trying to do, because we've got quite a few people in the audience here, let me see if we can get somebody else on live link. You can just hold those thoughts for a moment. Theo, is there a problem at your end in the studio? Because we cannot hear Faith here for some reason. You can just hear me. I think this probably is the same problem for...
You can hear me now?
Yeah.
You can hear me now? Yes, I just wanted to add on what Dr. Kalsi had spoken about. As part of our work, we worked with the veterans to identify 24 mass graves. Out of the 24 mass graves, while I was at the Kenya Human Rights Commission, we started working with the veterans to put up memorials in 2 of the mass graves. One in Chumbi, which it was suspected it had 10 mass graves. You know, the people around Chumbi from the Akamba tribe normally mark their graves with stones. There were 10 markings, and for each grave, we were estimating around 300 to 500 people on the Chumbi Hill. And on the Chumbi Hill, the Catholic Church bought that hill from land buying companies in the 1950s called the Katelembu Land Buying Company. So the Catholic Church had put up a church there, a shrine. The first engineer who supervised the building of the shrine was called Father Batista. Father Batista, they bought the land, but they built the shrine around the 90s. And if you talk to him, his estimate is like every hole or every stone marking might have between 300 and 500 bodies or bones of people, bones from people who were killed during the colonial era. That's times 10, we're estimating at maybe between 3,000 and 5,000 people who are buried at the Chumbi Hill. The other site that we were working on is the Tigio site in Limuru, where there was a police headquarters, and there is like a 600 meters sort of land, which you don't even need a tool. You just use your hands. If you just touch the soil with your hand, you'll come up with a human bone or jaw. So that is also another mass gravesite. We were trying to put up a memorial. We had approached the Kiambu County where the mass grave is, to try and purchase it purchase that land for us, so that we can be able to put a memorial there. But it was politicized, so we could not go ahead. So I'd say out of the research that I worked on while I was still at the commission, and I worked on together with the veterans, we were able to identify 24 mass grave sites, which we could pinpoint the location, and we had the history of those sites. Thank you very much, Peter. And as Dr. Kalsi talks about trying to get the government to be involved, it's something that we thought about, but for us to be able to exhume and even take the remains to a lab for analysis, we needed a court order. Justifying such a process in a court process was not easy because it's a lengthy process, and we were wondering if we'd have even the goodwill to do so. We thought of working with the police department so that it becomes part of the work. And we approached the then police commissioner, the IG, and we could not get political goodwill to do that. So that's why we were opting to not test the bones. We were opting to just build memorials for the known and unknown, heroes and heroines of the Mau Mau struggle. Because testing the bones is something that we could not do. In fact, even with Wanjugu, and I've had her speak, we went to Kamiti, and there's a mass grave there, and the mass graves are marked by stones, and on the stones there are inscriptions of prison numbers like 0 to 100, 101 to 200. And we were trying to locate the remains of Shuja Dedan Kimathi, and we could not, but there were mass graves there marked with blocks of stone. And the government let us in, but the goodwill to let us test the bones is what I could not see, or even the engagement, the attitude, like there was this, that you can just do whatever you're doing to memorialize, but testing, it will be politically explosive. So we could not do it. Of the 24, none of them have been really researched to know who were buried in those mass graves and how we can identify those people who are buried in those graves. Thank you very much, Peter.
That, in a sense, the political permission is given. And one of the things we're looking at strategically, which came from the discussions we had, is to have a request coming to the British government and the Kenyan government jointly from the House of Commons in the UK and from the Congressional Black Caucus in the US. Because the climate around that has been created about the appalling murder of George Floyd means that these issues now should have a traction which previously they didn't. And if the requests come from the diaspora, we think there may be more chance that people and governments will move in the right direction. Can I now turn to your very own lecturer, specialist, Dr. Mariam Kamunyu, who is just outside of the main hall, but she's been here from the outset. She is kindly agreed to speak and was behind the organization of this event, so many thanks to her, and obviously Lady Dean. And when I initially formulated the program, as a man, I really omitted, as we often do, the stories of women. So almost immediately, Marian and Faith said, no, this is not the whole story. I'm not quite as awful as that, but certainly I realized that I really had not made sufficient provision for that story to be told. And like most men will admit, if it wasn't for women in the struggle would never have got anywhere. So I humbly apologize for that, my omission. And can I turn over to you, Dr. Kamunyu, for that correction? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judge Peter. Thank you for that introduction and for that admission. Maybe you suspected that I would out you, so you said it yourself. So as he says, my name is Dr. Mariam Kamunyu. I am a human rights lawyer and a gender equality specialist and enthusiast. So like he said, one of my occupational hazards really is that when I listen to anything, I listen out for women's voices and experiences and perspectives. And so when Peter and I sat to speak about this project, and you're speaking about historical injustices, I just remember hearing very much the absence of the women's experience. And so my role here today is really simple, and it's simply to invite all of us to just honor and recall and examine women's participation in the struggle for Kenya's independence. Now, when Judge Peter initially invited me, I wrote a small paper only to realize that the good judge was literally availing me just 5 minutes of fame, which I'm now squandering with shabby jokes. So that said, I just want to share with you 3 thoughts today And the first is that I want to expose the exclusion, the erasure, the invisibilization of women in the narration of the Mau Mau liberation struggle. And secondly, I want to state here very briefly just a few instances of the participation and the persecution of women in the struggle. And third, I just want to leave you with a small reflection and a challenge. So on to that first idea on the exclusion of women. You know, they say that until the lion learns how to write, every story will always glorify the hunter. And in the case of the Mau Mau in particular, we can agree that the mainstream and popular history has been a record of the conqueror and not the conquered. Now, if we can agree on this narrative, and I'm sure many of you have since questioned your history classes, those of us who grew up in Kenya and went through the 844 system, now that we are older and we've had an opportunity to interact in this discourse, now realize that our history classes were a bit distorted and we've gotten a better sense of the real Mau Mau narrative. And what we see is that there's an even deeper erasure. Aside from the erasure of the story of the conquered, there's an even deeper erasure and invisibility in the case of the role of women, almost completely obscured from sight in the general narrative is the woman's story. While I do recognize that a lot of great work has been done, and I say this because as a researcher, I wouldn't even be able to make these conclusions, to tell you what was women's role if other people had not gone ahead and done this work. So I do recognize that work has been done. But nevertheless, like the good judge said, the male voices and perspectives narrating the Mau Mau ordeal far outnumber the female ones a great deal. The second thing, as I said, that I wanted to highlight today was just the participation and the persecution of women. With regards to the participation of women, there is the obvious, which is the domestic role. And this is very well known, the things that women did. They had to carry on with the domestic roles as the Mau Mau struggle went on, as they were doing other things for the liberation. And then the domestic role of women is really uncontested. So I will not focus here in my remarks. What I do want to focus on is the less spoken about roles. So for instance, the roles of women as combatants, for instance. You've had from Faith, you've had from Dedan Kimathi's daughter as well, that women were part of combatants. For instance, we have even a woman that was at the level of Field Marshal. We have Field Marshal Modoni Kerema. You have, for instance, Modoni Madenge, General Mathenge's wife, and you had many other women that were in combat. So, and that is something that is frequently not acknowledged. And then secondly, they acted as key, and this is really key from a combat perspective, and when you think of even armed conflict in this day, they acted as key external, internal conduits and scouts. So for instance, they were central in the transmission of food, in the transmission of ammunition, intelligence, medical supplies and clothing. They were all collected and disbursed to the forest fighters. And I must say at great personal risk to themselves, since they had to then go back to the villages where they could be outed and prosecuted for this. They also facilitated what were called posters after the word post office, which were pre-arranged sites which were used, they were the preferred distribution method of choice by the Mau Mau warriors. And so in some instances, for instance, I read very interesting research where women would, for instance, wrap bullets around the thighs of their infants and then tie these infants onto their backs and make a delivery to the forest edge. So as I'm saying, very risky, but the role they did play in this regard, as we can see, is clearly indispensable because the Mau Mau fighters did not have access to the outside, and yet they needed to survive in the forest. And so it's clear they were surviving in the forest because of the role that was being played by women. And secondly, I want to focus on the persecution of women, and this is where I will focus larger, because this is really one of the areas where there has been a great erasure. And, Ken Walibora put it best in an article that I saw when he described the female condition in Mau Mau as double incarceration. Women often find themselves in a double bind, whereby the general population is in a situation of strife and is in a situation where they're being brutalized and there are various challenges. But because of the female condition, you experience a disproportionate burden in this account, and I will demonstrate. One of the ways that women really were persecuted is through forced communal labor. So women were forced to endure, for instance, unending back-breaking terracing projects. So the colonial government, for some reason, were always building terraces, and women were the ones that were forced to perform this labor. And now this had two effects. So in addition to being forced communal labor, which in modern day or in other contexts could be called slavery, this meant that they remember they're the ones that also have the primary caregiver and now breadwinning roles now that the men are gone. And so they do not even have time to then work on their own farms to find provision for themselves. And so this really did act as a double-edged sword. The second thing is that women were also persecuted through detention, you know, and I'm sure you've heard colonial Kenya, particularly during the emergency period, referred to as Britain's Gulag, because nowhere else in the British Empire was confinement ever used as extensively as it was used in colonial Kenya. So for instance, as at the end of 1954, the daily average of Mau Mau detainees held in the colony reached a peak figure of almost 72,000 detainees. And then records show that at least 8,000 of these were women, and they were interned in a variety of prisons, detention camps, work camps, district camps, and more than 98% of these also were Kikuyus from the Central Highlands, as records show. The detention itself it wasn't just mere confinement, but it was characterized by very harsh living conditions, by brutality, by humiliation and constant violence, both physical and sexual violence. Women were raped, and interestingly, men were also raped in this detention camp. So that was one of the ways. Another ways that they were persecuted was through forcible repatriation of women and their children. So for instance, following the famous Operation Anvil, during that emergency, there was this Operation Anvil that was held in Nairobi, which led to the detention of thousands of Africans, mostly Kikuyus and their allies, and those who were deemed to be Mau allies or sympathizers. And following this operation, thousands of women and children were forcibly repatriated from Nairobi to the reserves in what we would today call forced displacement or internal displacement, which is an egregious international crime. And because they were also being targeted, like in that Operation Anvil, because they were also being targeted on the basis of their tribe, this could also amount to modern day ethnic cleansing, which aims to change the demographic composition of a certain territory, of a certain region. So again, if we also look at these atrocities through this modern day lens and these modern day definitions that we have since come up with from an international criminal law perspective, we can be able to see that this was indeed a great persecution of women. Women also endured extreme torture and sexual violence. So the violence was in various forms. So for instance, during hours of forced labor, various interviewees say that they were whipped for instance, showing fatigue or working too slow. You can imagine that you're being whipped for looking tired when you are in fact very tired. They endured public beatings and humiliations. These women were stripped naked. There are instances where, you know, they would do very humiliating things to them. So for instance, force them to run around with buckets of excrement on their heads while they're naked. Sexual assault was common, with rifle butts and bottles inserted into their private parts, breasts squeezed with pliers. Rapes were frequent, and these rapes were often in public. I read several terrible reports of rapes of mothers and daughters together, just out there in the open. These were really like public and almost like it was official policy. There was also confinement in ndakis. So ndakis were like makeshift cells, although calling it a grave would be more apt. They were like 4 feet deep holes, halfway filled with water and covered in sisal and branches, and they were infested with snakes and vermin. And so for whatever infraction, you know, or for no reason at all, you know, these home guards and this colonial government authorities would throw the women in these villages, or would be thrown in those ndakis for a few hours as punishment. And really, this is beyond cruel and inhuman treatment. So women and their dependents, particularly in those villages that were deemed to be allied to Mau Mau, lived in constant fear, not knowing when they would be singled out for the most minor infraction or for no reason at all, even, like I said. And then one of the final acts of persecution that I want to focus on is the extermination of women, something I do believe that there was a direct effort in the extermination of women. The targeting, the torture, the massacre, and the sexual assaults of women by the British is well established. There are particularly very many reports with regards to this targeting for Kikuyu women in particular. And I'm just giving the example of Kikuyu women just because there's a lot of research in this area, but acknowledging, as was said by Faith before and by Evelyn, that the struggle was indeed nationwide. And particularly for those women that were known relations or associates of Mau Mau fighters, they were particularly targeted. And so was there an official or unofficial colonial policy for the extermination of the Kikuyu, for instance? If assuming there was one, if we were to assume there was one, and given time, I would have prosecuted this more thoroughly because I do believe there was one. What would be the most efficient way to exterminate a community aside from detaining and killing its men? Surely an efficient way, if you were trying to do so, to exterminate a community, would be to target the woman and the child. And when I speak of extermination, ladies and gentlemen, it can happen in far more creative ways than death by bullet. So death by bullet is one of them. But it can include death by a combination of forced labor, of beatings, malnutrition, famine, starvation, and disease, and life in punitive barbed wire villages that you cannot get away from. So this was the reality for these women that were living in this emergency villages, as they were referred to. So this was a form of extermination, and was still at the time when reports were made to the colonial government, they denied this status. They said, no, it's just that in those villages, these women have refused education, so they're not clear on the right ways to feed their children. They did know how to feed their children, so yes, there was clear loss of life. There was clear massive loss of life owing to these factors that I'm describing, for instance, from starvation only. And so it is clear because there was loss of life and there are these factors and there's no help coming, they did want the villagers in the emergency villages to suffer and to die. So as you can tell from the foregoing, women, particularly those affiliated with the Mau Mau, because when you see those that lived in loyalist camps didn't suffer quite the same fate. So the women were completely dehumanized, and they were the biggest, most open and abused target of the conqueror and the colonizer. They really were a soft target just because they were available. And now, I describe these horrors against women to you, not to undermine any other role that was played, for instance, by the Mau Mau fighters. That can never be undermined, and it is indeed well recognized. But I describe these horrors just because the experiences of women are not as well known or as well narrated. And so, like I began by saying, the woman's role is thoroughly invisibilized. And yet I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, and without fear or favor indeed, that our liberation struggle would not have been possible at all without the participation and this hectic persecution of women that I'm describing to you. And so just as a final word, I think the rallying call is for me and really if I was to, I would be very happy and I really thank the good judge for already making this happen and for being so open when I said that I think we should have this discussion. The final rallying call really is that in discussing historical injustices, in any initiatives that we endeavor or to begin or to continue with regards to historical injustice, particularly with regards to this Mau Mau struggle, we must not be part of a fresh injustice by leaving out the experiences and the perspectives of women. If we do that, then this is a fresh injustice in not recognizing this sacrifice. And we must see women holistically. We must see their strength, their resilience, and their sacrifice that I have spoken about. So in all our discussions, like I said, all projects on historical injustice, we must consistently pursue what I like to call her story, because his story, and then his HIS story is very clear. But her story, like I've said, has suffered a lot of erasure. So even as we decolonize our minds of these fallacious narratives, of what happened with the struggle, we must simultaneously and always examine and recall women's participation and honor their sacrifice through acts of truth-telling and justice seeking. And I thank you very, very much for your attention. Thank you.
Kamunyu. I could listen to that her all day. And one of the things, humbly, is that all over the world, whether it's dealing with refugees in Lebanon or anywhere else, people who survived genocide in Rwanda, it is the women who often and the children who bear the brunt of the struggle. We talk about it as men, but it's the women and children who bear the brunt of the struggle. Could I ask one of our speakers from the diaspora in the United States now to draw some parallels between the struggle and the atrocities committed in the USA against the African American and other indigenous communities there. Vanita Banks is a former president of the National Bar Association, is a leading human rights advocate, and has had an international footprint, and is looking forward, once COVID is done, or lessens a bit, is coming to Kenya. And one of the things that we'd like to do is issue a very warm welcome to our brothers and sisters in the diaspora in the US, who really have not only made a difference within their own communities, but have over very many years sought to make a difference on the continent as well. Vanita Banks, can I turn the floor over to you? You've got a lovely audience here who are all masked up, but all still very attentive. So, and apologies for the technical hitches earlier on. Vanita Banks, thank you very much.
Thank you, Judge Herbert. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
It is a privilege to participate in this important discussion with this very distinguished panel today, focused on identifying the hanged massacre sites and memorials, which are issues that Kenyans and people of African descent in the United States and across the diaspora have in common. You've identified the detention sites where Kenyans were unlawfully detained, tortured, and killed. And we raise our collective voice in solidarity with you to advocate to the government to assist the Mau Mau Veterans Association in preserving these sites. And Judge Herbert and I have been seeking the support of the Congressional Black Caucus, as he mentioned earlier, to support these critical and important efforts. George Floyd's killing is the latest inflection point that has reinvigorated our global movement for justice and equality. There is tremendous power in our international advocacy and support of the Mau Mau Veterans Association to identify, exhume the remains, and rebury these citizens with dignity. The strength of our global collaboration is clearly demonstrated in the recently issued report and recommendations of the International Commission of Inquiry on Systemic Racist Police Violence Against People of African Descent. This report and recommendations, and of course, Judge Herbert participated as one of the international commissioners, along with commissioners from around the globe. This is another step, important and critical step toward justice, truth, and accountability, and seeking redress for the human rights violations of men, women, and children that have been historically abused by abusive police in the United States. And we must have truth and accountability must occur before we can move forward in reconciliation and with healing. And also, as many of you know, that a week before his death in February of 1965, Malcolm X stated in a speech in Detroit that the Mau Mau played a major role in bringing about freedom, not only in Kenya, but for other African countries. And the Mau Mau movement inspired the struggle for equal justice and equality in the United States. Our struggles are inextricably linked, and we must forge solutions together. Of course, there are many parallels between the Kenyan freedom movement and the African American civil rights movement in the United States. Malcolm X also stated that the greatest accomplishment that was made in the struggle for the Black man in America in 1964 towards some kind of progress was the successful linking together of our problem with the African problem. And he was talking about systemic racism globally, and that making our problem a world problem. And so Malcolm X knew that the problem of systemic racism was not just an American problem, but it was a global problem. And in terms of parallels, many of you know that a lawsuit was recently filed this year, in February of this year, against the city of Tulsa and several other defendants seeking restitution and accountability for 100 years of continuing harm to the descendants of the Greenwood District, as it is called, or otherwise the Black Wall Street, resulting from 100 years ago, almost 100 years ago, on May 31st and June 1st of 1921, a white mob descended on the nationally known Black Wall Street and burned over 40 blocks of Black-owned businesses and community to the ground. And to this day, there have been no arrest, no convictions, no reparations in compensation for the destruction of the country's greatest model of Black prosperity at that time. Over 300 Black Tulsans were murdered, and 10,000 Black Tulsans were displaced. And this lawsuit is intended to advocate for reparations and justice for the descendants, as well as assess accountability for the perpetrators, and again, document and publicize the stories of the 1921 massacre victims and their descendants. Again, we must tell the truth, and we must have accountability before we can move forward with reconciliation and healing. It has been estimated at that time the property loss was $100 million, and that equals approximately $1.5 billion. That was as a result of a calculation in 2020. Mass graves have also been recently discovered in Tulsa, and archaeologists and forensic scientists are working currently to identify the remains, and they are pursuing a process similar to what the forensic scientists on our panel described in her remarks. And as you know, African Americans have not received reparations for the unpaid slave labor that built the US economy, and that African Americans have been prevented from sharing in. A bill was recently introduced in the US House of Representatives to establish a commission to study reparations. We haven't been able to, even in the United States, establish a commission to even study reparations. And a bill has been introduced in Congress. It was introduced in Congress every year by the late, great, and my mentor, John Conyers from 1989 to 2019, the year of his death. And so we believe that the time for reparations is now, and that the Mau Mau settlement is certainly one of the global models to consider, along with the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'll also mention that local municipalities and states are moving forward with reparations. A Chicago suburb, Evanston, Illinois, recently passed a measure to pay reparations in the amount of $25,000 per eligible resident of Elgin, and based on a established fund of $10 million, which, you know, is a very modest start, but it is a start. And that fund will be funded by the marijuana sales in the community of Elgin. I wanted to also mention, with respect to memorials, that the human and civil rights lawyer Bryan Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Rights Initiative, has established a national memorial for peace and justice and legacy museum. And it was recently opened in 2018 and will be reopening as we're coming out of the pandemic. The museum depicts 800 6-foot steel monuments, which represent each US county where lynching took place. And engraved on each of the steel columns are the names and the dates of lynching of victims in the United States. And the museum is housed in a building that formerly warehoused slaves. And this memorial was intended by Bryan Stevenson, again, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. And his work has led to over 100 of his clients that had been on death row being exonerated for crimes that they never committed. The purpose of his legacy museum was to help all of us do what we must, which is confront the trauma of racism through visual truth and storytelling. And in the wake of George Floyd's death, memorials are important to truth telling and to preservation of legacy. And this memorial is dedicated to the legacy of victims of systematic racism, that were terrorized by lynching during Reconstruction and racial violence that is still occurring in our nation every day. And so, Judge Herbert, I want to thank you again for this opportunity, and we look forward to continuing this critical human rights work of our generation with all of you. Thank you.
Look forward to welcoming you in Kenya and other activists from the US to move the initiatives forward, not only with the government of Kenya, with hopefully with the African Union as well. Can I just turn to our two last speakers? We were hoping to have questions from the floor, but technically it might be a bit difficult. So can I just go to the two last speakers? And then if we can take questions, you can say what they are, I can repeat them, and then we can hopefully use those and have some people answer them online. The penultimate speaker is Dr. Duncan Ojwang, who is actually the Dean of Nazarene University, again, a prominent human rights expert, written and spoken eloquently on human rights, land injustices, the issue about the Mau Mau forest evictions, and a whole range of issues are very close to his heart. And as the speakers were recounting the injustice, one of the first places I went to in Kenya in my recent trips was to Kericho and Bomet. And I could not really believe the amount of land owned by British multinationals. And there's just a great juxtaposition where you have Unilever, James Finley Tea, and all the others having hundreds of thousands of acres of some of the best agricultural land in Kenya, and yet Mau Mau veterans having to scramble for some land which was theirs. And so one of the things that we are looking to try and do is to get rid of the multinationals out of Kenya, because actually all the expertise about growing tea, coffee, and anything else is here in Kenya. You don't need any British multinational to do that for you. So can I call on Dr. Ojwang to give his presentation, and then we will go to our last speaker, who's a Member of Parliament from the United Kingdom, Claudia Webb. Dr. Ojwang, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judge Herbert, and the previous speakers for this historical moment. I'm excited to be among the many here. I will be brief, and please give me cue when my time is spent. But let me start with what Malcolm X says, that if you stick a knife 9 inches into my back and pull it out 3 inches, then that is, even if you pull it all the way out, that is not progress. Progress is healing the wound. And they have not even started pulling out the knife. So that is Malcolm X quote on the speech he wrote, "Waiting in vain," and how the victims have waited in vain. That if you stick 9 inches knife on somebody's back and you pull 3 inches, then you cannot say, at least I've pulled 3 inches, only 6 inches are remaining. That is progress. In our case, they have not even started pulling the knife. I have a few remarks. All we can do in this few minutes is some academic soundbite, but very important. Of course, as an advocate, I realized within human rights that land is the river through which all other rights flow, especially in Africa. So if I'm talking of nation, if I'm talking of autonomy, if I'm talking of right association, it is the river. Nobody can live without land. And of course, you know how the issue of the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius that was embedded in the positive laws of international law, this comes. But let me come to the Mau Mau reparation and in general, and raise more of issues. The world have discussed whether there are some things that are unforgivable. Are there some things that are unforgivable? And that is in lieu that literature is showing Africans are more willing to forgive. But there are some crimes probably forgivable. That is just food for thought. And if everything is by whom? Is the or the tokens able to forgive the colonizers on behalf of who? You know, Desmond Tutu in the Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa ran through a situation where one lady, after the commission had pronounced forgiveness to this white supremacy, the woman told him, Tutu, you have no power or right to forgive that person. Neither do I, because the only person who could forgive probably is the person who was injured. So who has the power, not just the legal, but the moral to forgive or to negotiate for some?
I think the screen is frozen, as you can see. Let me see if I can call him. If not, what we can do is move to the last speaker. You know, I thought this was maybe just about today, but actually I've been in court hearings in London and they've been abysmal. Internet has gone down, gone up, sideways. So actually it's not really a surprise. So, but I do apologize for this. Let me see if I can call him. No, I'm not getting through. So what I'll do, I'll just text him and explain. But what I'd like to do, therefore, is go through to our last speaker for this afternoon, which is one of our newer Member of Parliaments, but a very old friend of mine, Member of Parliament for Leicester East, Claudia Webb, MP, who is one of the new cohort of Black women MPs who is really making a difference in not only in the United Kingdom, but across the diaspora. And she may say in her short presentation that in her maiden speech in the House of Commons, she specifically mentioned Kenya and the historical abuse. And so did her colleague, Bella Rabiro Ade. So we are trying in the diaspora to make common cause, and it doesn't matter that we're from Kenya or not, because there is a Pan-Africanism agenda, Pan-African agenda that we're trying to move forward. Wherever we're originally from. So can I just ask if Claudia can be introduced to the room, and I'll say we'll try and have a few words from Dr. Ojwang when his internet connection resumes. Claudia, I've just given you well, maybe not so marvelous introduction, but hopefully marvelous introduction. We're delighted to have you here again. I know you've been to speak to audiences in Kenya before, but can I, in a sense, when we discussed, is some of the ways in which, sitting where you are in Parliament in the UK, we may be able to move against the British government to right some of these historical wrongs, and what you may do and others may do to bridge the gap across the United States in the Congressional Black Caucus and the new administration there. But as to the floor, it's all yours. Thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. And I do hope everybody can hear me and certainly see me. You know, even from such a great distance, it's an immense pleasure to join such an esteemed panel of speakers for today's important event. If we are to achieve justice for historical atrocities such as the British repression of the Mau Mau Rebellion, as well as end the scourge of institutional racism and the destructive legacy of colonialism, international discussions such as these are crucial. So for those of you who do not know me, I am the Member of Parliament for my home city of Leicester in the UK. And I'm a proud anti-racist, socialist and anti-imperialist member of the African and Caribbean diaspora. I'm also incredibly proud to be the first British-born Member of Parliament of African descent from the beautiful Caribbean island of Nevis. I am deeply connected to the African and the Caribbean diaspora. My ancestors, of course, shaped my politics. Throughout the century, my foremothers argued, fought, suffered and died for the freedoms that I enjoy today. Present-day global inequalities remain permanently shaped by the horrors of extractive colonialism and racialized subordination. To combat this, we need the African diaspora to unite, to come together and fight the legacy of imperialism, which continues to oppress people across the world. One way in which we can do this through parliamentary measures is by forcing former colonial powers to recognize and repair the historical damage upon which their prosperity has been built. It is unacceptable the instances of appalling murder and violence at the hands of the British state have been erased from present-day memory of empire. Nowhere is this clearer than in Kenya. There is a collective amnesia in the United Kingdom regarding British torture camps in 1950s Kenya, where members of the Kikaya tribe were systematically tortured, starved, beaten, mistreated, and raped, as well as the massacre of the Sutuk people, where 1,800 Sutuk men, women, and children were murdered in a colonial land grab, and countless other atrocities. Britain's repression of the Mau Mau Rebellion has rightly been termed Britain's Gulag, in which 1.5 million Kenyans were confined to a network of detention camps and heavily patrolled villages. This was the colonial logic of elimination at its most extreme. It is one of the most shameful chapters of British history. In 2013, the British state issued a half apology for this institutionalized abuse. As the then Foreign Secretary William Hague said, he deeply regretted that these unspeakable crimes take place. 2,600 was issued each to just over 5,200 claimants. Whilst I'm glad that for many survivors of the British crimes, this provided some sense of closure, I do not believe that this offer from the British state is good enough. I believe a full, unequivocal apology is long overdue, along with serious reparations proportionate to the scale of the crime. Across Kenya, Africa, and other regions forced to endure the injustice of colonialism, indigenous communities were systematically alienated from their rightful lands. This historical injustice laid the groundwork for decades of uneven development and corporate extraction. As we see in the persistent damage caused by global tea plantations in Kenya's beautiful Bomet and Kericho counties. The brutal history of the British Empire casts a long and enduring shadow on present-day global dynamics. We cannot talk about the present without former empires engaging in a process of recognition, apologies, returning what was stolen, and reparations for the past atrocities. Across the world, instances of appalling murder and violence at the hands of the British state have been erased from our present-day memory of empire. These are the injustices which we as a diaspora must unite to oppose. I have been building the links with the African diaspora community, such as by campaigning for the Mama and Sotik massacres in Kenya to be taught as part of our national curriculum. The findings of the Kenya National Lands Commission in 2018 demonstrated the enduring human rights violation of the Kipsigis and Talai people. Yet I'm gravely concerned by the lack of awareness of the destructive history of the British Empire. But the time has come for former empires to apologize for and take seriously the historical debt that they owe to the countries, communities, and individuals who endured their cruelty. As a British Member of Parliament, I believe that we must consider the impact of Britain's colonial legacy in modern-day global insecurity and be ambitious about changing the unjust dynamics of global debt. The Jubilee Debt Campaign said that cancelling debt payments is vital to alleviate the mounting financial pressure on poorer countries. This was after the organisation found that more than 60 countries are spending more on paying their creditors than they are on their population's health. Many African countries commonly pay more than 10% interest on their borrowings, while richer nations are paying just 1% or less. In Kenya's case, the country currently owes the equivalent of 60% of its GDP in central government debt, according to the IMF. This is a direct consequence of the uneven power dynamics forged through centuries of violent extractive colonialism and imperialism. Britain and other Western countries have a moral duty to ensure that economically poorer countries do not disproportionately suffer from the coronavirus due to the unjust hindrance of global debt. Well, now is the time for Britain to seriously consider calling for an end to this historical unfairness. The coronavirus pandemic has further exposed these neo-imperial global inequalities, and across the globe, it is vital that the vaccine is distributed fairly and not for profit. Richer countries, including the UK, have secured over 3 times more vaccines than they need to treat their entire populations, while 67 of the poorest countries will only be able to vaccinate 1 in 10 of their populations over the next year. Much of Africa is not expected to have vaccines widely available until 2023. Much more is required to prevent a future of vaccine nationalism that will further entrench global inequality, and I will continue to lobby the UK government to ensure that everyone in the UK and across the world receives the best defence against COVID-19. Efforts such as these do not go nearly far enough to make up for centuries of cruel imperialism, yet they form part of the holistic engagement that is required for Africans and other victims of colonialism to receive the justice that has been long overdue. It is vital that we in the diaspora use our positions within parliaments to push for justice for victims of historical atrocities, such as the violent suppression of the Mama uprising. I would like to end by saying that whilst we in the diaspora, in Africa, whilst we are powerful, let us not forget we are not on our knees, we are standing up tall. And around the world, we do have allies. In the UK, we have allies, and around the world, we have allies who recognize and oppose the historical injustices perpetrated by the British Empire. And whilst we have much to do, we must keep working with movements for justice across the world to dismantle the perverse systems of institutional racism and neo-imperialism. So solidarity to you all. Solidarity.
Can I thank you for a marvelous and eloquent presentation, as always. And it makes me want to sit down and just listen to Claudia all evening. But it is heartfelt, and it is thorough, and it is somebody in a position of power and influence who I have absolutely no doubt has and will continue to make a difference, not only in the UK, but also in Africa, and particularly in East Africa, where she has spoken now on several occasions. So thank you very much, Claudia, and apologies for the technical difficulties we've had earlier today. We were going to have questions from the audience, but I think given the hour, that may be difficult. If somebody has a burning question they want, they can do so, but I'm well aware that the administration here have to go home and the weather is not brilliant. So can I ask your indulgence just to allow you to keep those thoughts, don't lose them. And what we'll do, through the administration and the law faculty, we'll take note of the questions and we'll make sure that there are answers provided. But we're also going to do three things. One, we're going to have a network of all the panelists that have spoken today, the others outside of the panel that are experts on Mau Mau and historical injustice. And we will have an alliance which we will look to bring back to Quair with Quair's patronage sometime November, December for a physical conference where we don't have to deal with so many technical hitches. And I apologize again for that. Can I just thank from the bottom of my heart, Quair University, the staff that you've seen, the staff that you haven't seen, the Lady Dean, the Vice Chancellor, Festus and Paul, and the head of administration who has made this so possible. We spent a number of hours trying to get to this stage. And sometimes, it works smoothly and sometimes not. But I really appreciate the efforts that have been made. Secondly, can I thank the Bandung administrator, Khadija Shaban, for the work that she's put in, and those back in London, Theo Ambrose, Viva Moon and Black Sox, and the people that you won't see, but have actually made it possible. And thank you actually for attending. I know it's been a long day, so thank you very, very much. And apologies for the delays and the technical hitches we've had. And finally, just in closing, when you see injustice and you're moved to do something, it actually doesn't matter where it is. So in recent days, you will have seen on your TV screens the scenes. You're coming up to the end of Ramadan. You'll have seen Palestinians being beaten and tear gassed and killed in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so for any human being, whatever your faith or lack of it or your religion, you must be treated with the dignity that, as in Mau Mau, people fought and died for. So we show our solidarity for Palestinians simply, and we note our concern for what is going on in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza at this time. That is another historical injustice, where the British had also a key role in developing and then leaving the scene and removing themselves from that when they chose to do so. So can I give you this assurance that the partnership Kenya Land Alliance, let me thank them as well for their expert support, the Mau Mau veterans, the Dedan Kimathi Foundation, Ms. Kimathi particularly, and all the workers and people and family members. I have learned so much and so humbled by you. Dr. Kalsi, you're here, and we do hope that your involvement and others will continue. And all those that aren't in the room but listening online, whether in the United States, in the UK, or here in Kenya, we thank you for your support, and we can commit to making sure that we will engage with the UK government, with the US Congress, and with the Kenyan government to move matters forward. And we will take the politics out of this issue insofar as we can, but we do give our endorsement, and I am humbled in a sense to be part of this struggle. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.